So I think we'll get started and people will gradually be joining us. So good morning, everyone. Cleona McGann, I'm the Director of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to welcome you all here today. This is one in a series of webinars that we've been running since the start of March. And we'd like to welcome all our participants, the members of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce and all our guests. On behalf of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce and our partners for this webinar, LK Shields and PwC. So the topic today, a very important one, is the Directors' Meetings and Duties, COVID-19 Challenges. And before we start, I'd just like to say that I will soon be introducing the moderator for this event. Beforehand, just to let you know, there will be some discussion and then also towards the end of the session, an opportunity to have some Q&A time. So you're very welcome to pose any questions using the Q&A button that you will see at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to address them at the end of the session. So just to introduce you to Ruairí Cosgrove, who's going to be the moderator for this session. And Ruairí heads up PwC's Entity Governance and Compliance Department and is the former president of the Chartered Governance Institute Irish Region. Ruairí advises on corporate governance, provides induction and training courses for directors, and undertakes governance reviews for organisations. So I'm going to pass over now to Ruairí, who will moderate the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Ruairí. Over to you.
Thanks, Tina, for that introduction. So look, I'm delighted to moderate this webinar on directors' meetings and duties and the challenges which have arisen during the COVID-19 pandemic. As Tina mentioned, we have an excellent lineup of speakers here today. We've Derek Kehoe, CEO and Head of Country Ireland at BNP Paribas. We've Dominique Kemp, award-winning chef, food writer and entrepreneur, and Richard Curran, partner at LK Shields. Today's webinar will last for 1 hour. The format will be Derek and myself discussing the challenges faced in running virtual meetings, which should last 20 to 25 minutes. I'll then hand over to Dominique and Richard, and they'll be discussing the challenges faced by directors in discharging their duties during the crisis triggered by COVID-19 for another 2025. And then we will take some questions. And as Tina mentioned earlier, there is a facility to ask questions through the chat on Zoom. So look forward to any queries you have. So going to kick off, Derek, as well as being CEO, you also act as chair to the International Federation of Irish Banks. And I suppose I'm going to ask you a couple of questions wearing your chair hat and then some with your CEO or executive hat on. So I'll kick off. Do you use icebreakers to compensate for the fact that you've only virtual interaction at these meetings?
Yeah, hi, good morning, Ruairí, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. Do I use icebreakers? Not really, to be honest with you, Ruairí. I think that in all of the boards that I'm involved in and all of the various different fora, people would know each other reasonably well. And, I guess it's one of the downsides of the virtual format is that we are missing that little bit of interaction before we go into the meeting, at the break time, after the meeting. But what I have noticed with virtual meetings is that they're typically much snappier than the format that we were used to, which is the physical interaction and the speaking to people. So we generally get straight to it. And also I would say, of course, that with all of my fellow either non-executive directors or executive management teams, we're in pretty much daily contact anyway. With the non-execs, maybe not so much daily, but certainly every other week. So I personally like to keep the meetings as informal as possible. I have worked for many years in various different institutions that do these sort of team building and ice-breaking exercises, and I've always found them a little bit cringeworthy. So it's not for me, I'd have to say. I'm not to say that it's not for everybody, having said that, but no, we generally just get straight to it.
Okay, very good. You mentioned the non-executive directors there. I think they are in a very tricky position because they can't come into a room, they can't have those sidebar conversations with the management team, with the other executive directors. And I suppose they probably are struggling most in this environment, given they can't physically turn up to a meeting and socially interact with other board members.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think it's a huge challenge for the non-execs, because really, a key role of the non-executive director is supervisory in terms of the executive management and in terms of the board, and it's very, very difficult to do that on a long-term basis virtually. And when we went into this pandemic, none of us thought that we'd be here toward the end of November in yet another lockdown. We joked at so many different board meetings over the course of, say, Q2 about, for Q3, I'll see you in Q3 and sure we'll be able to meet up in person. And here we are in Q4. So it is a big challenge for the non-execs. I think it's very, very difficult. It's even more difficult for our non-execs who are based overseas. But I wouldn't say it is the future. I think there is a logic to having physical meetings. There's also a logic sometimes to doing it virtually. But I think for the non-execs, it's more important than ever. My advice would be make sure that you are in touch with your chair, with your executive team, and also via the various committees that you might be on, subcommittees of the board. It's really, really important to keep that connectivity when we don't have the ability to be in the office, or I'm sure for all of the non-execs on the call, they will know that they do generally do their committee meetings in the office of the company that they're on the board of, and that interaction is now missing, and it is a big challenge. I completely agree. Yeah.
Okay, and again, wearing your chair hat, how do you ensure that all directors can contribute at a virtual meeting?
I think you just have, I regularly do round the table, so I don't think clearly if you have a seat at the table, you shouldn't be passive or silent anyway, but I think it's really, really important, particularly on matters where board resolutions or board approvals are sought, that everybody makes a contribution. So I do a tour de table regularly for, so after we have the various committee reports, if there are specific items on the agenda that need board approval, I ensure that every director has input into that, and that it's minuted, because clearly, more so than ever, I think when there is a look back done in 3, 4, 5 years' time, whether it be by your regulator or by your auditors, having any significant decisions that are taken during this time in the virtual format are going to have to be appropriately minuted, and also it's going to have to be minuted that there was significant and robust discussion, and from a regulator's point of view, challenge to these decisions. So really important that everybody's contribution is sought and noted, I would say.
Great. I might come back to the point on the minuting, because I think the role of the company secretary has become a bit more onerous now when you're hosting a virtual meeting. And just on, have you a digital or online etiquette that you encourage your board members to adhere to during a meeting?
Great question. No is the short answer, but I need one urgently. I think we're all learning. We are learning as we go along. I found, and I was having this conversation with a couple of people actually in the last few days, as in the lead up to this morning's event, and I think we're all getting better in terms of our digital etiquette. At the outset, it was a little bit chaotic. And then, the pendulum swung completely the other way, and nobody wanted to say anything in case they were talking over somebody else. So I think we have to do, and I haven't done it yet, but I will conduct some online training for all directors in whatever the digital platform of your choice is, and they're quite uniform in terms of how you use them, but. We can have much more civilized board meetings if everybody is raising their hand via their Zoom facility for doing so, or whatever platform they use. And it actually beats the format where people were talking over each other and you couldn't hear a word that was being said anyway. But we haven't got there yet. And I think, like I say, at the outset it was chaos. Now I worry a little bit that maybe people are not speaking up because they're afraid of interrupting the other person who has just jumped in. So digital etiquette is better than it was, but I'd be worried that we might be losing something at the same time in terms of debate, which is really, really important.
And a related point, I see it myself. I'm using, an iPad at the minute on this meeting. I will see emails coming in or messages coming in. I have to bat them away, and it does distract you from the meeting, and you can lose focus. Have you any sort of advice as to how to keep, meeting participants focused and engaged?
Again, I think you have to. I think as chair, you just have to work that a little bit harder to ensure that everybody is contributing to the meeting. It is quite funny that whilst we're not all physically around the table, pretty much every single board that I'm involved in, they are video meetings. So you can actually pick up a lot because people forget they're on video. So the body language can tell you a lot because people forget they're on video. And I think, if you see signs of exasperation in an individual because somebody else is hogging it or being overly theatrical, shall we say, then as chair, you have to clearly move in, get the director who is displaying those passive aggressive signs to make their contribution, and then move on. Because on the one hand, you have to balance the fact that you need the meeting to run to a certain length of time, because all of our times are clearly restricted. But on the other hand, you need to keep people focused. I think it's very difficult actually in the virtual format to stay on point for 2-3 hours. It's much more difficult than it is when you're all sat around a boardroom table together.
No, it's an interesting point. I think what I've certainly seen is that in the old days, this is a year ago, you would have the board all fly in or meet at a certain location, and they try and get through as much business as possible. So I think, a 6-hour board meeting in the real world is tough going anyway. A 6-hour board meeting in the virtual world is almost impossible. So because you don't have the logistics of travel, you could actually have 3 2-hour meetings and get through, the strategic piece, the operational piece, whatever you need to hit. So I think, are you seeing maybe shorter, more focused board meetings more shorter board meetings than one longer one?
Yes, and I'd have to say that is the big win of this entire thing, is that meetings are shorter. And, it is, I was never a big fan of these meetings that went on 3, 4, or 5 hours anyway. And I would have always questioned the value of meetings that extended way beyond. I think 3 hours is the absolute max, that for me personally. So when I have seen board meetings that have gone from 3.5 hours down to 1.5 hours without losing any of the significant content or significant debate. So you ask yourself the question, well, why were they taking 3.5 hours in the previous format? Because maybe there was a little bit of grandstanding or theatrics. So I think they've become much, much more efficient. And I think that is a good thing, to be honest with you, because no matter what, the one thing we cannot buy is time. And so why are we wasting it with going around in circles on a topic for 45 minutes that actually you can get resolved in 10? I think it's all the more important than ever, though I've always tried to do this anyway. If there are substantive issues that are going to cause significant debate around the board table, then you need to be well aware of them in advance, insofar as you can be. And I think if there are specific issues that specific directors have that have arisen at the audit committee or risk committee or whatever it may be, then it is better to hammer them out to the extent you can before you go into the board. And then you can record the discussion and the debate, but you have a fair idea of what the end point is going to be. I really would never be, one of the first things I was taught when I did my director's training was that really no board meeting should break up without consensus. And if it has, this is what my trainer told me anyway, was that as chair, you've probably failed. You should, at first point, you should adjourn the meeting to try and resolve the issue, but you should never actually finish a board meeting without resolving an issue. And I think that is more so the case now than ever because of our virtual format and because we've lost that sort of, water cooler or cup of coffee moment where people can air their views. So it's a question really of you've got to work the phones and make sure that you are aware of the issues, that directors, your fellow directors feel they have complete access to you, which is very important at any time, to be fair, and that issues, as you go into the board, you should be aware of what is going to take more time than other topics, for example. And again, as chair, it's really up to you to ensure that the meeting runs to time, but you have discretion within that agenda to manage the time on the topics that are of most importance.
Very good. And on, you mentioned sort of the passive aggressive director, or, you know, maybe eye rolling during the meeting. I mean, the dynamic has changed a bit. Do you think it's more difficult to disagree or debate or challenge in a virtual world when compared with the real world?
I do actually, and it would be, you know, I think it would be cause for concern from a governance perspective for any entity that is regulated. The regulator, you know, wants to see challenge, particularly from our independent directors. They want to see challenge and evidence of challenge. And I do think it's more difficult in the virtual format than in when everybody is around the table together. But it goes back to your earlier point, Rory, I guess, in terms of digital etiquette. We have to figure out a way of getting better at this so that, you know, challenge is recorded appropriately. And you know, I think in order to do that, it's really, again, it's going to have to be run from the chair, and the COSEC actually are going to have to run the meetings a bit like Cleona and Nicola and Leah are running this one, which is everybody gets their time to speak, but then, you know, it's not chaos either.
Okay, just interested in your view on the board papers. Obviously, you know, good quality board papers are key for a good meeting. Are you seeing maybe the board papers change in any way because you can't be giving people, you know, a 300-page pack, especially if you're getting it digitally? Are you seeing more focus on good executive summaries or, you know, graphics in those types of papers?
So again, I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here. I'm sure, Rory. You can never overestimate the value of a well put together board pack, no matter what the format, whether it's physical or virtual. So I'm very, very fortunate, I'd have to say, certainly the boards that I serve on, that the board packs are generally excellent. But we did go through a period. I was, you know, getting 600-page board packs. Now, with the best will in the world, you're just not going to get through a 600-page board pack and absorb it all 5 working days before a meeting, given everything else that goes on. So the condensing of the pack, I think, is important. I think there's a lot of stuff that can go into the appendix. And I think they do need to become more streamlined. You have to ask yourself the question, what is relevant to have in your pack and what is not? So definitely the board packs have slimmed down, but I think that's a welcome thing, to be honest with you. I think if you have, again, with a well-organized company secretary, you will have a very good board calendar and board cycle of the calendar. So everybody should know what's coming up during the course of the year. You should have your strategy sessions where you're deciding what is going to be the strategy over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And then during the course of that 5-year cycle, at any given time, what board meeting during the year are you going to discuss the updating of the strategy? So everybody should have a very clear vision of what's coming up. Clearly, there will be topics that are ad hoc. But I think the board packs, no, absolutely, they have slimmed down. It's a welcome thing. But there should be clarity as to what you expect in your board pack anyway. And I think a well put together board pack saves everybody a lot of time.
Yeah, no, I definitely echo that. And I mean, from my perspective, I think you mentioned the company secretary. I think their job has become more difficult because, as well as taking the minutes of the meeting, which is an art in itself, they're also then often managing, you know, a technology glitch has happened and they're trying to manage a non-exec director who's got locked out or something. I mean, do you see having IT to support the company secretary? Would that be something you would see in your organization?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. But generally the problem occurs in real time and IT are nowhere to be found, or because they're working remotely as well. So it is very, very difficult. I completely agree. And I think the COSEC's job is becoming more difficult. Minutes are becoming, you know, they need to become more expansive every single year. And it's very, very difficult. And I honestly wonder, I don't know how many of our guests this morning are working in regulated entities, but I think a day will come when the regulator will look for digital recordings of the meetings, which is going to make things much more different. Because I mean, how many times have all of us sat around a board table where somebody said, not for the minutes? So if you're digitally recording your meetings, that's not going to happen for starters. Maybe we'll never get to that. I mean, minutes are, should be what they say on the tin, which is a summary of the meeting. It's not a blow-by-blow account. But nonetheless, I've, in say 6 years of this role, I've gone from a situation where minutes were 2 pages long to minutes that are now 9-10 pages long. And still, our regulator would say to us, they don't feel that they are sufficiently robust. Not always, but you have that. So very, very difficult job for the company secretary. They're juggling lots of things during the meeting and still trying to make an accurate record of everything that takes place. So when we go back to physical meetings, which I'm sure, well, I hope we will at some point, maybe it'll become a little bit easier, but I think the whole issue around what constitutes a good set of minutes is a debate that's not going to go away either.
No, I think that has been around for a while. I think there's a constant battle is probably too strong, but certainly difference of opinion. The COSEC capturing the essence of the meeting and delivering it, and then the regulator almost wanting a stenographer's note on exactly what happened. And I think the danger might be if we start recording these director meetings and on other meetings, that people will be a little more circumspect about what they say and the dynamic will change. So I think and I have seen more meetings being recorded, but simply because the COSEC's hands are so full that it just gives them an opportunity to create the minutes maybe a day or two afterwards and have the value of that recording. So that's it's an interesting point and one that will be debated. You mentioned sort of the board packs, but I mean, do you invite comments from directors, non-exec directors in advance of the meeting, just so it will save time during the meeting?
Yes, if there are topics, I mean, typically I would speak to the directors in advance of the board anyway, just as a matter of course, particularly those directors that are chairing the various committees. So I will, you will get the committee reports, read the minutes, and if there are things that stick out, you need to have a conversation anyway. So I would like to think, though it's, we don't live in a perfect world, obviously. I would like to think that generally we are aligned on the way into the meeting, or if not aligned, I have a fair idea of where, like I say, what the pressure points are going to be. It doesn't always work out like that, but I personally get a lot of value from speaking to the directors consistently during the course of the quarter. Our board meetings tend to be quarterly, because there's a lot going on, and I really find it very, very useful to have a very good and consistent contact, particularly with my independent directors, because they are sitting well above the fray, shall we say, and it's just all the more important that I get their perspective, and they need to be confident that I am there. I mean, what my message to them always is, I'm your point of escalation. If there is something that you feel is not right, or that you're not getting satisfaction on, I really want you to come to me long before it becomes an issue. Don't let anything fester. So it's constant communication. Like I say, with the execs, it's not an issue because you're seeing them during the course of the daily business anyway. It's much more important for me particularly with the independent non-execs.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, and I have one or two questions, then I'll close out. When we return to a new normal, do you think boards will continue to meet virtually, or will there be a clamour to get around the table again?
I don't think boards should be conducted virtually forever. For all of the reasons that we've just discussed, I think there's too many things you miss, and I'm a firm believer in that personal interaction between directors. I genuinely miss those board meetings where you might, if we have a morning board meeting, I might bump into one of the directors in CHQ for a coffee before the board, or we might go for a quick bite of lunch or a sandwich after the board. I think those things are really, really important. Now, having said all of that, I think we have proven that virtual meetings can be as effective. We have the digital technology. We always had it. We just chose not to use it. I think particularly for ad hoc meetings, they should really be conducted virtually. I think for those boards where we have directors traveling from overseas, logistically it can be difficult to organize physical meetings from time to time, because if they're traveling, it basically takes a day and a half out of their schedule. So I would personally have no problem, with directors attending 3 out of 4 board meetings physically per year and 1 virtually. But I do think the physical meeting format, I think people will be clamoring to get back into we see it just with work colleagues. They're very, very keen to get back into the office. So look, we want the best of both worlds, Rory. We want, we want a little bit of remote interaction and a little bit of actual face-to-face as well. I would say, for me, 75% of the meetings should be attended physically, but it's a subjective view, to be fair.
Oh, it's very interesting. I might wind it up there. Thanks so much, Derek. I mean, I'd be delighted when I get around the table. I will no longer hear the phrase "you are still on mute," which seems to be oft expressed at these meetings. Derek, that was brilliant. Great insights. Thanks very much. I'm now going to hand over to Richard and Dominic. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory, and thanks, Derek. Some very interesting insights there. In particular, the reference to the decision-making process and minute-taking at meetings, which is very relevant and very important in the context of what we're going to talk about now, which is directors' duties in the COVID crisis. I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of directors' duties under Irish company law, and then I'm going to ask Dominic a few questions just around the practical application of directors' duties in the context of an operational business, given the fact that she's experienced it firsthand in the current crisis. Just to set the scene, under Irish company law, directors' duties are owed to the company and the company alone. The directors also have regard to the members and employees, but where the company is insolvent, the duties are owed to the creditors. It might be worth just setting out the principal duties of the directors, their fiduciary duties, and they were codified for the first time under the 2014 Companies Act. I'll just list them out. There's a duty to act in good faith in what the director believes to be the interests of the company, act honestly and responsibly in relation to the conduct of the affairs of the company, act in accordance with the company's constitution and exercise their powers only for the purposes allowed by law, not use the company's property, information or opportunities for their own or anyone else's benefit, not agree to restrict the director's powers to exercise independent judgment, and to avoid any conflict between the director's duties and their own or their other personal interests, to exercise care, skill and diligence, and to have regard to the interests of the company's members, as I said. There is a separate section which talks about having regard to the interests of employees as well as to members. As I mentioned, where the company is insolvent, the duties are then owed to the creditors, and the following circumstances arise. The directors have a duty to have regard to the interests of creditors, as I alluded to. They have to put the company into creditors' voluntary liquidation if it's unlikely that the company will return to solvency. They have to preserve the company's assets so they can be applied in discharge of its liabilities. And they have a duty not to make payments directly or indirectly to themselves to the detriment of creditors. We're going to kind of talk about personal liability and circumstances where a director can be personally liable for the debts of the company, because I think that's particularly pertinent to the current circumstances where directors are assuming substantial risk. There are various scenarios where that can arise, but I'm just today going to talk about the circumstances of reckless trading. Effectively, a director can be found liable for reckless trading where he carries on trading knowingly in the knowledge of the fact that the company is insolvent. This would be in the context of an insolvency process, such as a liquidation or an examinership. So reckless trading is defined, and again, I'll just set it out. If he carries on business and having regard to the general knowledge, skill and experience that may reasonably be expected of a person in his position, ought to have known that his actions would cause loss to creditors, or similarly, if he contracts a debt but did not honestly believe on reasonable grounds that the company would be able to pay the debt when due, along with its other debts. So if a director breaches his duties, he can also be liable to the company for any gain which he makes, or to indemnify the company for any loss that it incurs. This action can be taken by a liquidator. It can also be taken by the Director of Corporate Enforcement or any creditor in the course of a winding up where the company has breached its duties. There's a lot of references there to honestly and reasonably, and there is relief under the Act where a director does act honestly and reasonably. So directors can take some comfort from that. And the courts do apply a subjective test in assessing directors' decisions. So the court won't step into the director's shoes and assume his position in reaching a decision. Courts recognise that directors operate in difficult and stressful trading environments. So they'll rarely set aside or question a director's decision, as long as it was arrived at, as I say, in the honest and reasonable belief that it was in the interests of the company. The question also as to whether the directors were aware that the company was insolvent, and hence, as I said, the duties are then owed to the creditors, is also a subjective test. So the courts will take that into account. It's important just to point out, though, that the test for reckless trading is an objective test, so there's a clear definition in the Act, and a director can be deemed to have traded recklessly in causing loss to creditors or incurring a debt which could not be repaid. In more serious cases then of dishonesty and irresponsibility, there are restriction or disqualification orders which can be sought, and directors can also have criminal liability for breaches of the Companies Act, which I won't go into here. Just coming to you, Dominic, there are potentially substantial personal liabilities for directors who breach their duties or engage in what could be considered reckless trading. I think it's helpful what Derek and Rory were talking about there, just in terms of having clearly documented decision-making processes in place, minuting the directors' meetings. It's also important for directors to keep regular and detailed financial and accounting information so they know what position the company is in. They should also consult their professional advisors to inform and sense check their decision-making and assess risk. There's also guidance from the ODCE on this, which was issued over the summer. But just at a more practical level, and just looking at the complex and conflicting obligations of directors in the current crisis to keep trading and keep an operational business alive in what really are wildly uncertain trading conditions, can I ask, how do you feel directors should reconcile their duties and potential risk of substantial personal liability with a view to keeping a business going? And at what stage should directors just take the view there's too much risk and uncertainty and just place it into insolvency?
Well, I suppose, Rico, and thanks very much for inviting me to talk this morning. And I suppose it really is the sort of million-dollar question that you're faced with as a director, and certainly in the hospitality business where we've been shut down repeatedly. And certainly when the rug was pulled out from under us on March the 13th and we all started to shut down that weekend, we were all really at that point where we're at the end of what is considered in our industry the very worst trading period of the year. So if we were to all look at that day that we all closed, that sort of snapshot, definitely most businesses were in a pretty bad situation in terms of just not having revenue coming in and really wondering how long that was going to last for. There was a certain amount of comfort, I suppose, knowing that everyone was in the same boat, and that we had not deliberately put ourselves in that position. I think that's really important. So I think this goes back to what Rory and Derek were talking about in terms of then constantly revisiting the information. So, you know, it was asking those same questions, trying to figure out what we could do when we were looking at budgets, what sort of supports we were going to be able to stick in. Not that you could rely on those, but certainly looking and seeing under each line, what would the new budget look like, taking into consideration potential changes to VAT, the sort of wage support, and any sort of possible grants. The only thing that we could do back in March was really freeze everything and really go into a period of hibernation, except for the sort of core team. And it was just pressing pause on everything. I mean, lockdown really made us all want to make hasty decisions and to be able to act quickly and decisively. But at the same time, we really did have to kind of press pause and look at all the information. And again, you know, once we did those updated budgets and we started to try and see, you know, what was the business going to look like, taking a really hard view in terms of revenue and dropping it from everything from 50% down to, you know, up to 70% reduction in revenue. And it was to look at where was that sweet spot? What was the business going to be able to do? What sort of cuts were going to have to be made? And sort of how much additional pain could the business withstand? This current lockdown being a case in point, because certainly when we got open in June, it was like, great, we can get motoring. But at the same time, then locking down again, September 18th has caused another layer of pain. So again, on top of that, not only do you have to look at these decisions and try and figure out what is the best decision, what can the business likely do, but you also have to look at the team and say, right, do we have the energy, not just the capability and the expertise, but do we have the energy to have this constant sort of up and down of opening and closing? And, you know, I think when we're looking at the board and the decisions and the sort of idea of reckless trading and so on, I was struck by the late Peter Drucker's comments in relation to board failures, those big catastrophic corporate failures. And his observation, and I quote, was that the board was the last to realize that things were going wrong. And he said that in 1992. COVID has meant that we're all incredibly and painfully aware of what's been going wrong and the impact. So I think we've all had to kind of put these bigger decisions on hold until we can make truly informed decisions. And if you look at the really simple premise, and these are the things that I try and use as guiding principles. Certainly, if you look at what a good director should be, you know, acting in the best interests of the company, certainly trusting, testing your instincts, showing leadership, being informed, as well as challenging all decisions. And Derek, you mentioned challenge again. That sort of challenge is important, but again, through the lens of a pandemic, where do those values sit? I mean, I think that's the tricky one. So again, if we go back to the sort of G20 OECD principle and those sort of basic tenets, if we look at accountability, integrity, and transparency, I think those are possibly the real guiding lights during a crisis.
Okay, thank you. Some interesting insights there, and that actually leads me to the next part of the talk, where I was going to just talk about the different approaches to corporate governance and directors' duties in different jurisdictions. And it was quite interesting in looking at it and comparing to how other jurisdictions reacted, such as the UK and France in particular. In adopting the director's duties that I listed out earlier, Ireland chose what's known as the shareholder value approach to directors' duties in corporate governance, as opposed to the more holistic pluralist approach, which holds that directors owe duties to more than just their company. Interestingly, France actually adopted a similar approach to Ireland, in that each director owes individual duties to the company to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the shareholders as a whole. Ironically enough, the UK chose a more pluralist approach, which would be more aligned with mainstream EU thinking as it's going at the moment. And this provides in the UK Companies Act that directors should have regard to the likely consequences of any decision they make in the long term, the interests of employees, the need to foster the company's business relationships with suppliers, customers, and others, the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment, the desirability of the company maintaining a reputation for high standards of business conduct, and the need to act fairly as between the members and the company. It's also worth pointing out that in the UK, directors actually had their liability limited for wrongful trading during the pandemic period, which is the kind of rough UK equivalent of reckless trading to the end of September, whereas Ireland didn't adopt that approach, although it was something that was looked at by the CLRG. France extended their solvency tests for the period of the initial lockdowns and introduced extensions to accounts filing deadlines and flexibility around the holding of meetings, which were similar to what was introduced in Ireland in the COVID Companies Act, which was introduced over the summer. We also broadened the criteria for insolvency in that act, and the ODCE also issued a statement that they'd have regard to the impacts of the COVID crisis in considering any enforcement action against the directors, which is obviously a helpful direction. But it would seem just that the UK regime, as I outlined there, would seem to be more suited and flexible to accommodate directors' duties in the current crisis, as opposed to that narrower shareholder value approach, which ourselves and France have adopted. There is a bit of a raging debate about this at the moment, as between the wider capitalist system around stakeholder value and stakeholder capitalism and what that actually means, as opposed to narrower, just focusing on short-term shareholder returns. That's a bit outside of the scope of our talk today. I think we'd be here for quite a while if we were going to talk about that. The EU have, though, just kicked off a consultation process on a study they're doing on directors' duties and sustainable corporate governance. And the key consideration for that, as I say, is a move from a focus on short-term shareholder value towards more long-term interests of the company in terms of kind of sustainable value creation. I mean, some commentators do also say and point out that directors should really just focus on making money and selling products or delivering services, and they shouldn't be lumbered with unspecified duties to the environment, social responsibilities, etc., which are really more for governments to sort out as opposed to private enterprise. But as I say, that's a larger debate. Dominique, again, just having experienced firsthand the challenge and stress of operating a business in an unprecedented crisis, can I ask what your thoughts are on the different models there as exemplified by the Irish, the French and the UK approach, and now being considered by the EU? And I wonder, are there any operational considerations which should be included in the law? Obviously recognising the limits on legislation, but just in terms of directors' duties and liabilities, which can kind of more realistically take into account the experiences that directors actually encounter on the ground.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the consultation process is probably very timely, especially due to COVID. You know, and if we think that laws ideally should take a sort of common sense approach, I guess when you're looking at some of the goals of that pluralistic approach, they're probably already well embedded in a well-run company. You know, if we think about it nowadays, what corporation doesn't brag about its commitment to staff, the integrity of the supply chain, and certainly where they fit in with community values? These are all sort of important issues in relation to, you know, customers and high standards. You know, customers in general have an expectation that is directly related to a company's brand, you know, and I think we don't necessarily expect to hear Michael O'Leary talking about yoga and wellness programs. That's not, you know, we'd probably be quite shocked if we were shareholders. And certainly when you purchase from Ryanair, you're certainly prepared for a certain level of service. You know, you're not expecting that sort of Rolls Royce. So when we look at their model, you know, definitely shareholder value, and certainly they are acting in the best interests of Ryanair. But certainly what's been crucial, I guess, during COVID is not necessarily something that can be captured by legislation. And that's really the ability to make good judgments, which is really critical for directors at the moment. And if we look, what is good judgment? Because it's sort of you know, so subjective, really. And this definition by Sir Andrew Leakerman from the London Business School was, again, a quote, that the combination of personal qualities with relevant knowledge and experience to form opinions and take decisions. So therefore, you know, what he's saying is it is a process. Information has to be taken in. You have to decide whom and what to trust. You've got to check all along the way that you're not falling into a kind of groupthink or personal bias, reviewing the available choices, and then being able to make an informed decision based on that information. Also, one of the things that you touched on, it was also about knowing when you are out of your depth, and again, being able to seek better knowledge to get better advice, and again, knowing, do you have the ability to listen and be self-aware of what's going on? Can you detach yourself from your personal views, for example? And again, the sort of examples of poor judgment are often the sort of tendency not to listen to others, to ignore others and stick to the rules regardless of the context. Again, not taking in information or filtering out information that doesn't agree with your point of view. And again, these are all things that can increase with age. So we have to always be vigilant that we're not falling into these traps. Certainly reading that Ernst & Young report, I was very much struck by the simplicity of option C, which was the hard legislative approach, and possibly the best option, you know, because again, you touched on the sort of shareholder capitalism and so on. Maybe that is the best option, because certainly, I guess, an acknowledgement that long-term goals are probably a better and more sustainable way of building value into companies, rather than this sort of short-termism. You know, I think young business leaders need to be able to learn from the success stories. And I thought one good case study was David Coate from Honeywell, and he was the former CEO. And he felt that, you know, the idea that corporate leaders have no choice but to embrace just short-termism in the face of pressures from investors was one of the most pernicious beliefs circulating in business. So again, it's that sort of stakeholder capitalism, but this expectation that companies have to do everything, that they have to fix all social ills, I think that would be a mistake. But certainly those sort of social responsibilities that are possibly relevant to the business, that maybe is certainly a better approach.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, the phrase "never waste a crisis" has been much used and abused in recent months, but I mean, it seems the current crisis is probably a unique opportunity to look at directors' duties and corporate governance in the light of an extremely complex and volatile business environment. I mean, we obviously recognize the limits of legislation, but I think it certainly needs to be looked at in the context of a modern capitalist system, looking really to reduce risk for directors, but while still protecting creditors and other stakeholders in the business, but recognizing the wider environment and society that a business operates in. So I think the EU consultation is particularly topical in that context.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Dominic. That was a good discussion, and thank you for your answers. Rory, I'll pass back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard and Dominic. A lot of food for thought there. I'm going to come to some questions now, just in the last 10 minutes or so. So we have a question here regarding virtual AGMs. So when hosting a virtual AGM, should the stakeholders have an open mic, like a physical AGM? How much moderation is justified? I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to take that one there, but I'll open it and the panelists like to make a comment on it.
Rory, well, I would just say that, you know, yes, they should have an open mic. The shareholders are the owners of the company. They are entitled to have their say. Now, clearly, yeah, like a virtual meeting, like a physical meeting, there comes a point at which, you know, the mic has to be passed on. So, and there has to be relevant input from whoever that stakeholder may be. How much moderation should there be? Well, that really depends on the person who's chairing the meeting. and then the shareholders can decide whether they have a good chair or a bad chair. So, the power should be in the shareholders' hands, but absolutely there should be an open mic in my view. But just be mindful of the fact that, particularly in a large meeting, many people may want to have their say.
Absolutely. The point I would make is that like the AGM is the only chance that the shareholders have a chance to question or challenge the board. And I think by not giving that opportunity, you just build up problems. And it is important that these issues are vented. I know post the crash, we had some very volatile meetings at AGMs, particularly in the financial services sector. And but giving people an opportunity to vent, it is much better than having it all bottled up. So I do think it's important. In the early part of the year, we did a lot of AGMs held where the legislation wasn't there and people were using hybrid models. There was some people could speak, some people could dial in. The questions had to go in beforehand. So it's good to see the legislation is there and that's cleaned all that up. Another question I have, I might ask the three of you this. Like we're 9 months in or 8 or 9 months into this. I think people are more comfortable with the technology. But at the start of this, so your meetings in March and April, was there much issues with technology and managing those meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the technology was pretty seamless. I think it's and again it goes back to what Derek was saying. It's the body language, people can look really bored on screen, and I think that can be a problem. So you're trying to kind of keep an enthusiasm for meetings and for the content of meetings. They're short and sweet, but when you're there talking or other people are talking and everyone's looking really bored and stuff, they can tend to fizzle out. So I think it's being mindful of that. But certainly, I think everyone was pretty tolerant of the fact that there were going to be interruptions and technical glitches, but it's the sort of pregnant pauses, it's the lack of dynamism, it's the pause, it can feel like an eternity online as opposed to being in a physical room. So I think those are the difficulties, and certainly if meetings are straightforward and just about getting things done and inform people, that's one thing. But where we find in business where you're looking to do something around a creative process or a sales process, that's where these meetings tend to really suffer.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, I think,
go on.
Just to, I mean, as we discussed earlier, in the beginning it was pretty chaotic. I mean, but again, the digital technology existed, it just hadn't been rolled out on a mass basis. So doing that quickly was the challenge, certainly in a large organization like BNP Paribas. But it's one of those things, had it been a project in normal times, it would have taken decades probably to get everybody, all stakeholders aligned. And in the end, it was done in the space of a couple of weeks. And very quickly, I think people learn how to behave in the virtual world. It's not perfect yet, but I do believe that that it's a lot better, as I said earlier on, a lot better than it was at the outset, and a lot less chaotic. And one takeaway from this current crisis is that all of these digital tools only enhance the way we conduct our business, and certainly make life a little bit more efficient. In terms of it's much easier to organize a virtual meeting than a physical meeting because people don't have to set aside so much time to attend. So I think it went from chaotic to reasonably well organized, I would say, in fairly short order.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned the time, because if you think about the amount of time that people spent traveling from A to B to get to a meeting, to sit in a room for 3-4 hours, that time's been freed up now. So directors have more time to read board papers, they should be better informed. So all that I think is very positive, and it's to get the balance right. I think to your point earlier, Derek, whether we'll have people doing 75% of roundtable meetings and then 25% virtual, it might be a nice mix and not put people under as much pressure to get to a boardroom somewhere in the world. I'm conscious of time. We're just coming up just before 11. Maybe one more question. I don't know. I suppose I'll maybe ask an open question to everyone. Like what do you think we'll take from this virtual meeting experience? Has anyone any views on that?
Yeah, I think you just can't replace human interaction, not fully. And so we have a great workaround in terms of technology, but we are human beings, and the social connections are a critical part of that. And I think that's what we recognize and probably appreciate. So hopefully what we'll take away is that we can be a lot more efficient. We don't necessarily need to demand people's presence all the time. And ideally we can have the best of both worlds going forward.
Yeah, completely agree with Dominic. I mean, you can have all the money in the world, but you cannot buy time. So let's not waste it. let's value it.
I think ironically, it could actually help with a lot of companies with their decision making, with their kind of consideration of, as we talked about there, the importance of proper decision making, the importance of minute taking, the importance of referring to the financials and really being on top of the operations of the company. I think ironically, this pandemic will actually help all of that, because people are doing that a lot more. And if anything, communication is nearly improving, because people are much more conscious of it and much more aware of the need for good communication. So I think ironically, it could actually turn out to have been a good thing for communication and for management of companies.
Great, thanks, Richard. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to wind it up there. So I'd like to thank you all for your attendance. I'd like to thank our speakers, Derek, Dominic, and Richard. And lastly, thank Cliona, Nicholas, and Leah in the chamber. Au revoir, tout le monde. I will now hand back to Cliona.
Thanks, Rory.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much. And thank you, Rory, for moderating this very interesting and interactive session. Just very quickly to remind everybody, we have the Ireland France Business Awards next Thursday. That's our highlight event to celebrate Franco-Irish business achievement. So we hope you will all join us then, and we'll be doing something special for Christmas on the 11th of December at lunchtime. So once again, thanks to our panel of speakers, really appreciate it. Thanks to the team, Nicola and Leah, who have really helped set this up. And also, like to say to everyone, keep safe and well. And as a networking organization, this is what we excel in. We cannot wait to have the option to really meet you as well as virtually. So thank you, merci beaucoup, bonne journée, et à très bientôt, j'espère. Merci, au revoir.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bye-bye.